I should have known something was wrong the day the moving truck pulled up across the street. The house at 2847 Maple Street had been empty for months, a weathered for sale sign swaying in the desert wind like a warning I was too blind to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But when I watched her step out of that sleek black sedan, designer sunglasses perched perfectly on her nose, something cold settled in my stomach. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged here, who had planned this moment down to the last detail. What I didn't know then was that she hadn't just bought a house. She had bought a front-row seat to the destruction of my marriage. The Arizona sun was merciless that Tuesday morning in March, casting harsh shadows across our quiet subdivision in Oakwood Heights. I had been living at 2840 Maple Street for 7 years, ever since David and I had scraped together enough for the down payment on our modest 2-story home. It wasn't much by Phoenix standards, but it was ours. The neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors' schedules, where Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down could tell you exactly when the mail arrived each day and who had been watering their lawn after city restrictions. I was folding laundry in our bedroom when I first saw her. The sound of diesel engines and hydraulic lifts had been echoing through the neighborhood since dawn, but I had been too busy getting ready for work to pay much attention. David had already left for his job at the engineering firm downtown, coffee, mug abandoned in the sink as usual, his morning routine as predictable as the sunrise. That predictability had been comforting once. Now I wondered when it had started feeling more like evidence. Through our bedroom window, I watched the movers carry in box after box of expensive-looking furniture, modern pieces that seemed too sophisticated for our neighborhood of ranch houses and desert landscaping. The woman directing them wore white, linen pants that somehow managed to stay pristine despite the dust that coated everything in Phoenix. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and even from across the street, I could see the glint of gold jewelry catching the morning light. Something about her posture, the way she surveyed the street with calculating eyes, made me step back from the window. It was ridiculous, I told myself. New neighbors moved in all the time. There was nothing unusual about a woman my age buying a house in a decent neighborhood. But my hands had gone cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking directly at our house, studying it with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to finish the laundry and get ready for work, pushing the strange encounter to the back of my mind. My job as a paralegal at Hendricks & Associates kept me busy, enough that I rarely had time to dwell on neighborhood gossip. But throughout the day, during quiet moments between case files and client calls, I found my thoughts drifting back to the woman across the street. There had been something familiar about her silhouette, something that tugged at the edges of my memory like a song I couldn't quite place. When I returned home that evening, David was already there, which was unusual. He typically worked late, claiming the engineering projects required his undivided attention well into the evening hours. But there he was, standing in our driveway, talking animatedly with our new neighbor. The setting sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and from where I parked, I could see them both clearly for the first time. She was stunning in that effortless way that some women manage to achieve. Mid-30s, I guessed, with the kind of skin that suggested expensive skincare routines and regular spa visits. Her smile was bright and engaging as she gestured toward her new house, and David was hanging on every word with an attention I hadn't seen from him in months. The way he leaned slightly forward, the way his hand moved through his hair, a nervous habit I knew well, sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary, watching them. David said something that made her laugh, a sound that carried across the street like wind chimes. She placed her hand briefly on his arm, a gesture that could have been innocent, if not for the way David's entire body seemed to react to the contact. His shoulders straightened, and he took a small step closer to her, drawn in by whatever magnetic force she seemed to possess. When I finally got out of the car, They both turned toward me. David's expression shifted so quickly it was almost comical, guilt flashing across his features before being replaced by an overly bright smile. The woman's reaction was more subtle, but equally telling. Her eyes assessed me from head to toe, in a single, calculating glance, taking in my wrinkled work clothes, my tired expression, my slightly disheveled appearance after a long day at the office. "Lisa," David called out, his voice carrying a forced enthusiasm that made me wince. "Come meet our new neighbor. This is Amanda Walsh. She just moved into the Henderson place." Amanda extended her hand with practiced grace, her grip firm and confident. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Lisa. David has told me so much about you." The words were perfectly polite, but there was something underneath them that made my stomach tighten. How much could David have told her in the span of a single conversation? And why did her smile not quite reach her eyes when she looked at me? "Welcome to the neighborhood," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "What brought you to Oakwood Heights?" "Oh, you know how it is," Amanda replied with a casual wave of her hand. "I needed a fresh start, and this area seemed perfect. Quiet, safe, close to everything I need." Her gaze flickered toward David for just a moment. "The neighbors seem particularly friendly." David beamed at the compliment, and I felt something sharp twist in my chest. When was the last time he had looked at me with that kind of pleased satisfaction? When was the last time my presence had brought that light to his eyes? "Amanda works in marketing," David added, still looking at her with obvious admiration. "She's got some fascinating projects lined up. Really cutting-edge stuff." I nodded politely, though I noticed he hadn't mentioned what kind of marketing. Or for which company. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but I found it difficult to focus on the words. Instead, I was cataloging details. The way Amanda's perfume seemed to linger in the air between them. The way David kept finding excuses to look at her even when I was speaking. The way she seemed to know exactly which questions to ask to keep him talking. When we finally excused ourselves to go inside, David was practically bouncing with energy. He talked nonstop through dinner about Amanda's interesting career, her sophisticated taste in furniture, her impressive knowledge of the local restaurant scene despite having just moved to town. Every comment felt like a small knife, each observation a comparison that left me wanting. "She seems nice," I said carefully when he finally paused for breath. "Nice?" David looked genuinely surprised by my lukewarm assessment. "She's incredible, Lisa. Smart, accomplished, worldly. We're lucky to have someone like that in the neighborhood." The enthusiasm in his voice was unmistakable, and it cut deeper than I wanted to admit. When was the last time David had described me as incredible? When was the last time he had looked at me and seen anything beyond the familiar routine of our 7-year marriage? That night, I lay awake long after David had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the unease that had settled in my chest like a stone. Through our bedroom window, I could see the faint glow of lights from Amanda's house across the street. She was still awake too, moving around behind the thin curtains she had hung in what appeared to be her living room. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the coincidence of an attractive single woman moving across the street was just that. A coincidence. David had never given me reason to doubt his faithfulness. He was predictable, reliable, sometimes maddeningly routine in his habits. Infidelity seemed too spontaneous, too messy for someone who organized his sock drawer by color and never forgot to set the coffee maker timer. But as I watched the silhouette moving behind those curtains, I couldn't shake the feeling that Amanda Walsh hadn't chosen our neighborhood randomly. The way she had looked at our house during that first morning, the way she had seamlessly inserted herself into conversation with David, the way she seemed to know exactly what to say to capture his attention. It all felt too calculated to be chance. The next few days only reinforced my growing suspicions. Amanda seemed to have an uncanny ability to be outside whenever David was leaving for work or returning home. She would emerge from her house at precisely the right moment, always, with some neighborly reason to strike up a conversation, a question about the garbage pickup schedule, a request for recommendations about local services, a casual comment about the weather that somehow stretched into lengthy discussions about everything from Phoenix restaurant recommendations to David's engineering projects. I watched these interactions from behind our living room curtains, feeling like a spy in my own neighborhood. Each morning, Amanda would appear in yoga clothes that suggested she maintained her figure with dedicated effort. Her hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow looked perfectly styled. She would stretch on her front porch, her movements slow and deliberate, perfectly timed to coincide with David's departure for work. The conversations themselves seemed innocent enough. Neighborly chatter about local happenings, friendly inquiries about David's work, casual observations about the community, but there was an intimacy to their body language that made my stomach churn. David would lean against his car door, making no effort to leave despite claiming he was always running late for important meetings. Amanda would step closer as they talked, closing the distance between them in increments so subtle that David probably didn't even notice it happening. What bothered me most was how different David seemed during these interactions. The man who barely grunted good morning at me over his coffee cup transformed into someone animated and engaging the moment Amanda appeared. His laugh came easier. His posture was more confident, and his eyes held a spark of interest that had been absent from our conversations for months. I started timing my own departures to coincide with these morning encounters, hoping my presence would interrupt whatever magnetic pull seemed to exist between them. But Amanda was too skilled at navigating social dynamics to be deterred by something as simple as a wife's protective instincts. She would smoothly include me in the conversation, asking about my work with apparent interest, complimenting my appearance with words that sounded genuine but felt hollow. "Lisa, you look lovely today," she would say, her tone perfectly warm and sincere. "That color is beautiful on you. David, doesn't your wife look wonderful?" David would glance at me with the distracted attention of someone suddenly reminded of an obligation, offering a quick smile and a murmured agreement before turning his focus back to Amanda. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable, and I could see the satisfaction flicker in Amanda's eyes as she watched my confidence deflate. It was during one of these morning encounters that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Amanda was asking David about his schedule for the week, a seemingly innocent question that any friendly neighbor might pose. But as David rattled off his appointments and meetings, I realized she was taking mental notes, cataloging information about when he would be home, when he would be free, when I would be at work. She was mapping our lives with the precision of someone planning a campaign. That afternoon, I found myself driving past Amanda's house on my way home from work, taking a different route than necessary just to get another look at the place that had become the center of my growing anxiety. The house itself was unremarkable, a single-story ranch similar to most homes in the neighborhood, with desert landscaping and a red tile roof that matched dozens of others on our street. But as I slowed to study the property, something caught my attention. The mailbox bore not just Amanda's name, but a small business logo I didn't recognize, something called Strategic Consulting Solutions. I made a mental note to look it up later, though something about the generic name felt deliberately vague. More troubling was what I noticed about the house's positioning. From Amanda's front windows, she would have a clear view directly into our living room and kitchen. Our bedroom window was visible from her side yard. She had chosen a house that offered surveillance opportunities that felt far too convenient to be coincidental. When I mentioned this observation to my best friend Rachel over lunch the next day, she listened with the patient attention of someone who had heard me obsess over details before. Rachel Kim had been my closest friend since college, and she knew me well enough to recognize when I was spiraling into anxiety-driven overthinking. "Lisa," she said gently, setting down her sandwich and leaning forward across the small table. "At Sunrise Cafe. I know you're worried, but don't you think you might be reading too much into this? Maybe she's just a friendly person who happens to be attractive. I wanted to believe her, but the evidence was mounting in ways that felt impossible to ignore. It's not just that she's friendly, Rachel. It's how she's friendly. She knows things about David's schedule, about his work projects, about our routines, and the timing of her appearances is too perfect to be random. Rachel sipped her iced tea thoughtfully. Have you talked to David about any of this? The question hit a nerve I had been trying to avoid. How do you tell your husband that you suspect the attractive new neighbor of having ulterior motives without sounding jealous and paranoid? How do you explain that their innocent conversations feel like threats without concrete evidence to support your concerns? What would I say? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That I think Amanda moved across the street specifically to seduce him? That I believe she's some kind of predator who targets married men? He would think I've lost my mind. Maybe, Rachel said carefully. But maybe he would also appreciate knowing that his wife is concerned about their marriage. Have things been difficult between you two lately? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a question I had been avoiding asking myself, but Rachel's gentle probing forced me to confront truths I had been pushing aside. David and I had been distant for months, maybe longer. Our conversations had become functional rather than intimate, focused on logistics rather than connection. We shared a house and a routine, but somewhere along the way, we had stopped sharing much else. We've been like roommates, I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Polite roommates who happen to share a bed. I can't remember the last time we had a real conversation about anything that mattered. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Then maybe Amanda isn't the real problem here. Maybe she's just a symptom of something that was already broken. Her words stung because they carried the weight of truth, but they also crystallized something important for me. Whether or not David and I had grown apart, whether or not our marriage had lost its spark, Amanda Walsh represented a threat that I wasn't prepared to ignore. If my marriage was going to end, it would be on my terms, not because some calculating stranger had decided to dismantle it for her own purposes. I need to know more about her, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in days. I need to understand who she really is and why she chose our neighborhood. Rachel looked concerned. Lisa, please be careful. If you're right about this woman, then getting too involved could be dangerous. And if you're wrong, you could end up damaging your marriage in ways that can't be undone. I nodded, understanding the risks, but knowing I couldn't continue living, with the uncertainty that was eating away at my peace of mind. I have to know, Rachel. I can't just sit in my house and watch her work whatever game she's playing. I need to take back some control. That evening, I sat in my home office with my laptop open, beginning what would become an obsessive research project. I started with basic searches for Amanda Walsh, but the name was common enough that the results were overwhelming and largely useless. I tried adding Phoenix and marketing to narrow the search, but still found nothing that seemed to match the woman living across the street. The business name from her mailbox, Strategic Consulting Solutions, yielded slightly more promising results. The company appeared to have a minimal web presence, just a basic website with vague descriptions of marketing and business development services. No employee photos, no detailed client testimonials, no specific industry focus. It was the kind of online presence that suggested someone wanted to maintain the appearance of legitimacy without revealing much actual information. As I dug deeper into public records and business registrations, a pattern began to emerge that made my pulse quicken. Strategic Consulting Solutions had been registered just 6 months ago, around the same time that David had started working late more frequently. The business address listed was a generic office suite in a commercial complex downtown, the kind of place that rented temporary space to consultants and freelancers. But it was when I started searching property records that I found the information that changed everything. The house at 2847 Maple Street hadn't been purchased by Amanda Walsh through normal channels. Instead, it had been bought by Strategic Consulting Solutions as a business property, then transferred to Amanda's name in a transaction that seemed designed to obscure the original source of the funding. More disturbing was the timeline. The initial purchase negotiations had begun 8 months ago, well before the house had been officially listed for sale. Someone had approached the Henderson family with an above-market offer before they had even decided to move, convincing them to accept a deal that benefited everyone except the neighbors who might have been curious about the unusual circumstances. I leaned back in my desk chair, my heart pounding as the implications settled in. Amanda hadn't stumbled across our neighborhood and fallen in love with a house across the street from us. She had specifically targeted this location, arranging the purchase months in advance, and created a business entity to facilitate the transaction. This wasn't a coincidence or a crime of opportunity. It was a calculated long-term plan. But a plan for what exactly? And how did David fit into whatever scheme she was orchestrating? As I sat there in the glow of my laptop screen, staring at property records that proved Amanda Walsh had gone to extraordinary lengths to position herself in our lives, I realized that everything I had suspected was just the tip of an iceberg. The friendly new neighbor with the perfect timing and strategic conversations wasn't who she claimed to be, and her interest in David was far more serious than casual flirtation. I closed the laptop and walked to our bedroom window, looking across the street at Amanda's house. The lights were on, and I could see her silhouette moving behind the curtains again. This time, though, I wasn't watching with vague unease and growing suspicion. I was watching with the cold clarity of someone who had just discovered they were in a war they hadn't known was being fought. Amanda Walsh had made her opening move months ago, planning and positioning herself with military precision. But she had made one crucial mistake in her strategy. She had underestimated the woman whose life she was trying to destroy. Now, it was my turn to make a move, and I had no intention of playing fair. The next morning I woke with a sense of purpose that had been absent from my life for months. The property records had given me concrete proof that Amanda's presence in our neighborhood was no accident, but I needed more information before I could confront David or take any definitive action. I needed to understand the full scope of whatever game she was playing, and that meant I had to get closer to the truth without revealing my hand. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and spent the morning developing what I could only describe as a plan of attack. If Amanda was surveilling our family, then it was time for me to return the favor. I positioned myself at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and my laptop, ostensibly working from home, but actually documenting her patterns of behavior. Amanda's routine was remarkably consistent for someone who claimed to work in marketing consulting. She emerged from her house at precisely 8:15 each morning, dressed in workout clothes that looked more like fashion statements than actual exercise gear. She would spend exactly 20 minutes doing yoga poses on her front porch, movements that seemed designed more for display than fitness. The timing coincided perfectly with David's departure for work, giving them their daily opportunity for spontaneous conversation. After David left, Amanda would disappear inside for about an hour, then emerge again dressed for what appeared to be a business day. But instead of leaving for an office, she would spend the next several hours moving around her house in ways that kept her visible from our windows. She watered plants that didn't seem to need watering, organized her garage with the door conspicuously open, and made frequent trips to her mailbox that seemed unnecessary given the minimal amount of mail she received. Most telling was what happened in the afternoon. Around 3 o'clock, when I would normally be returning from work, Amanda would position herself in her front yard, finding projects that required her presence precisely when I typically arrived home. She was tracking our schedules with obsessive precision, ensuring maximum visibility and opportunity for interaction. But it was her evening routine that made my stomach turn cold. After David arrived home from work, Amanda would find reasons to be outside until well after dark. She would take phone calls on her front porch, her voice carrying just enough for us to hear that she was engaged in what sounded like important business conversations. She would retrieve items from her car multiple times, each trip taking her past our house. She would stand in her driveway, supposedly checking her mail or examining her landscaping, but her attention was clearly focused on our windows. She was watching us live our lives, cataloging our interactions, studying the dynamics of our marriage with the intensity of a researcher conducting a behavioral experiment. By midday, I had filled several pages of notes documenting Amanda's surveillance patterns, but I still didn't understand her endgame. Was she simply an opportunistic predator who had identified David as a vulnerable target? Or was there something more specific about our situation that had drawn her attention? The elaborate nature of her house purchase suggested this was more than casual husband hunting. I decided to test a theory that had been forming in my mind. If Amanda was as calculating as she appeared, then she would respond to changes in our routine in predictable ways. I needed to see how she would react when presented with unexpected information, and I needed to gauge whether David was already more involved with her than I suspected. Around 2 o'clock, I called David's office, something I rarely did during work hours. His assistant, Jennifer, answered with her usual professional cheerfulness. "Hi, Jennifer. It's Lisa. Is David available for a quick call?" "Oh, hi, Lisa. I'm sorry, but David stepped out for a client meeting about an hour ago. He said he'd be back around 4. Would you like me to have him call you?" I felt my heart skip a beat. David had told me that morning that he had back-to-back meetings all day and wouldn't be available for personal calls. If he was out of the office, where was he? And why had he felt the need to lie about his schedule? "That's okay," I told Jennifer, keeping my voice steady. "I'll just catch up with him at home tonight." But I had no intention of waiting until evening. I grabbed my keys and drove toward David's office building, taking a route that would allow me to scout the area for his car. The engineering firm occupied 2 floors of a glass office building in downtown Phoenix, with a parking garage that I had visited numerous times for company events and holiday parties. David's silver Honda Accord was nowhere to be found in its usual spot, nor anywhere else in the parking structure. I expanded my search to nearby restaurants and coffee shops, places where he might conduct an informal client meeting. Still nothing. It was when I decided to drive through a residential area about 10 minutes from David's office that I spotted the familiar outline of his car parked in the driveway of a small adobe house. My hands began to shake as I pulled to the curb half a block away, grabbing my phone to confirm the address. The house belonged to Amanda Walsh. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, watching for any sign of movement from inside the house. The curtains were drawn, making it impossible to see what was happening within. But David's car remained in the driveway like evidence of a crime I wasn't ready to fully comprehend. When David finally emerged, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. His hair was disheveled in a way that suggested hands had been running through it, and his shirt was wrinkled despite the fact that he had left home that morning looking perfectly pressed. But it was his expression that told the real story, combination of satisfaction and guilt that I recognized from the early days of our relationship, when stolen moments together had carried the thrill of secrecy. Amanda appeared in the doorway as David reached his car, and even from my distant vantage point, I could see the intimacy of their farewell. She leaned against the door frame wearing what appeared to be a silk robe, her posture casual but deliberately provocative. David turned back toward her twice before finally getting into his car, their eye contact lingering with the intensity of people who shared secrets I could only imagine. I waited until David's car disappeared around the corner before starting my engine, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The evidence was undeniable now. My husband was having an affair with the woman who had orchestrated her way into our neighborhood, into our lives, with surgical precision. But instead of falling apart, instead of collapsing under the weight of betrayal and humiliation, I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. Amanda had made a critical error in her carefully constructed plan. She had assumed I was a passive victim, someone who would either remain oblivious to her machinations or crumble under the pressure of discovering them. She had severely underestimated the woman whose marriage she was systematically destroying. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table, waiting for David to return home. I had spent the afternoon researching divorce attorneys and private investigators, arming myself with information about asset protection and evidence gathering. I wasn't ready to deploy that knowledge yet, but having it gave me a sense of control that had been missing from my life for months. When David walked through the door, at his usual time, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed his deception was still intact. His greeting was cheerful but distant, the kind of perfunctory affection that married couples exchange when they're going through the motions of intimacy. "How was your day?" he asked, loosening his tie as he headed toward the refrigerator. "Productive," I replied, my voice steady. "I worked from home and got caught up on some projects. How were your meetings?" David's hand paused for just a moment as he reached for a beer, the question catching him off guard in some subtle way. "Fine," he said, his tone carefully casual. "Just the usual client stuff. Pretty boring, actually." I nodded sympathetically, watching as he avoided making direct eye contact. "Jennifer mentioned you had a meeting off-site this afternoon." "New client?" The lie came so easily that I could see he had been practicing it. "Yeah, potential project in Scottsdale. Preliminary discussions probably won't amount to much." He took a long drink of his beer, using the action to buy himself time to craft the deception more fully. These things usually fizzle out once they realize what quality engineering actually costs. I made a non-committal sound, as if the details of his workday were of only passing interest to me. But inside, I was cataloging every aspect of his performance. The way his voice carried just a hint of defensiveness. The way he positioned his body to avoid facing me directly. The way his fingers drummed against the beer bottle in a nervous rhythm I had never noticed before. "Amanda stopped by this afternoon," I said, the lie sliding off my tongue with surprising ease. David's reaction was immediate and telling. His entire body went rigid, and the beer bottle slipped slightly in his grip before he tightened his hold on it. "Oh?" he said, his voice pitched higher than normal. "What did she want?" I shrugged, feigning mild annoyance. "Something about organizing a neighborhood barbecue. She seems to think it would be good for community building." I paused, watching his face carefully. "She mentioned that you two had talked about it." The relief that flooded David's expression was almost comical. He had been terrified that Amanda had revealed something about their afternoon together, but my fictional story about a neighborhood barbecue gave him safe ground to navigate. "Yeah, she brought it up yesterday morning," he said, his confidence returning now that he believed he understood the parameters of our conversation. "Sounds like a nice idea. Might be good to get to know the neighbors better." I nodded agreeably, though something bitter rose in my throat at his easy enthusiasm for spending more social time with his mistress. "She certainly seems eager to integrate into the community. It's impressive how quickly she's settled in." "She's a remarkable woman," David said, his voice carrying an admiration that cut through me like glass. "Smart, organized, really has her life together. We could probably learn something from her approach to things." The casual cruelty of his words, comparing me unfavorably to the woman he was sleeping with, crystallized my resolve in ways that months of marriage counseling never could have achieved. David wasn't just betraying our marriage. He was actively diminishing me in order to justify his behavior to himself. "I'm sure we could," I agreed, my voice betraying none of the fury building inside me. That night, as David slept beside me, with the peaceful expression of someone whose conscience was clear, I stared at the ceiling and finalized my strategy. I had confirmed David's affair, but I still didn't understand Amanda's larger motivation. The elaborate house purchase, the months of planning, the strategic positioning, it all suggested objectives that went beyond simple adultery. I needed to understand what Amanda ultimately wanted, and I needed to gather enough evidence to protect myself when this situation inevitably exploded. Most importantly, I needed to turn the tables on two people who had been playing games with my life, while assuming I was too naive or too weak to fight back. Over the next several days, I began implementing what I privately called Operation Transparency. If Amanda wanted to watch our lives unfold, then I would give her something worth watching. If David wanted to maintain his double life, then I would create situations that forced him to choose between competing loyalties. I started small, with strategic modifications to our routine that would create opportunities for Amanda to reveal her hand. I began leaving the house at different times, sometimes returning unexpectedly in the middle of the day. I started engaging David in conversations about our future plans, our financial goals, our dreams for retirement, topics that would naturally lead to discussions about our assets and security. Most importantly, I began documenting everything. I purchased a small digital camera with a powerful zoom lens, and I started photographing Amanda's comings and goings, building a comprehensive record of her surveillance activities. I kept detailed logs of her interactions with David, noting the times, duration, and nature of their conversations. The evidence I gathered painted a picture of a relationship that had progressed far beyond casual flirtation. David was visiting Amanda's house multiple times per week, always during work hours when I was supposed to be at the office. Their conversations had evolved from neighborly chatter to intimate discussions that involved considerable physical contact. Amanda had begun dressing more provocatively when she knew David would be around, and David had started paying more attention to his appearance before leaving for work. But it was when I decided to follow David to one of his supposed client meetings that I discovered just how deep their deception had become. I had called in sick again, becoming more comfortable with the small lies that my investigation required. When David left for work that Thursday morning, I waited exactly 15 minutes before following his route downtown. Instead of going to his office, however, David drove directly to a high-end hotel in the Scottsdale Resort District. The Phoenician was the kind of place where David and I had celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary, a luxury resort that charged more for one night than many people spent on rent. I watched from the parking lot as David walked through the elegant lobby with the confidence of someone who belonged there, carrying an overnight bag I hadn't seen him pack. 20 minutes later, Amanda arrived in her black sedan, wearing a designer dress and heels that transformed her from suburban neighbor into sophisticated temptress. She moved through the hotel lobby like she owned it, drawing appreciative glances from other guests as she made her way toward the elevators. I sat in my car for 2 hours, alternating between numb disbelief and crystalline rage. This wasn't a simple affair born of opportunity and weak moment. This was an elaborate, ongoing deception that involved significant financial expenditure and careful coordination. David wasn't just cheating on me. He was actively building a parallel life, with another woman using our shared resources to fund romantic getaways I knew nothing about. When I finally drove home, I found myself oddly calm. The last traces of doubt had been burned away, leaving me with perfect clarity about what needed to happen next. David and Amanda had been playing a game where they held all the cards, and I remained ignorant of the rules, but that dynamic was about to change dramatically. I spent the afternoon researching the Phoenician's reservation system, using skills I had developed as a paralegal to access public records and cross-reference information. It didn't take long to discover that David had been booking rooms at the hotel for the past 3 months, always on weekday afternoons, always charged to a credit card I didn't know existed. The financial implications were staggering. David had opened secret accounts, redirected portions of his salary, and been systematically hiding assets from me while funding his relationship with Amanda. This wasn't just adultery. It was financial fraud that could have serious legal consequences. But as I sat in my home office, surrounded by evidence of my husband's betrayal, I realized that Amanda's motivations still remained unclear. She was obviously benefiting from David's generosity, but her elaborate infiltration of our neighborhood suggested objectives that went beyond financial gain. She wanted something specific from this situation, something that required her physical proximity to our daily lives. The answer came to me with sudden, terrifying clarity as I reviewed the timeline of events. Amanda had begun her planning 8 months ago, around the same time that David's engineering firm had won a major contract with the city of Phoenix. The project involved infrastructure development worth millions of dollars, with David serving as the lead engineer overseeing critical design decisions. Amanda wasn't just seducing my husband for personal reasons. She was positioning herself to gain access to confidential information about municipal contracts, inside knowledge that could be worth enormous amounts of money to the right bidders. David's affair was providing her with pillow talk that could influence major business deals. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just dealing with a husband's midlife crisis and an opportunistic homewrecker. I was up against a sophisticated operation that involved potential corruption, breach of fiduciary duty, and possibly criminal activity. Amanda had chosen David not because of his charm or attractiveness, but because of his professional access and his apparent vulnerability to manipulation. She had studied our marriage, identified the weaknesses in our relationship, and engineered a seduction designed to compromise him both personally and professionally. As I sat there processing the full scope of what I had uncovered, I felt something shift inside me that was both terrifying and exhilarating. For months, I had been reacting to Amanda's moves, trying to understand her game while she maintained all the advantages. But now I understood not just what she was doing, but why she was doing it. And that knowledge was about to become the foundation for the most important strategic decision of my life. I walked to the window and looked across the street at Amanda's house, where she was undoubtedly planning her next move in whatever elaborate scheme she was orchestrating. The lights were on in her living room, and I could see her silhouette, moving behind the curtains with the same calculated grace she brought to everything else. But this time, I wasn't watching with confusion or growing dread. I was watching with the cold focus of someone who had just realized they were holding cards their opponent didn't know existed. Amanda had made her move months ago, positioning herself with what she believed was perfect strategy. Now it was time for her to discover what happened when the prey decided to become the predator. The revelation about Amanda's true intentions had left me sleepless for 3 nights running, my mind churning through possibilities and strategies like a computer processing data. I knew I couldn't take on this situation alone. Amanda was too sophisticated, too well prepared, and David was too deeply compromised for me to navigate this minefield without allies. But finding trustworthy people who could help me expose what was happening required careful consideration of who might have their own reasons for wanting the truth to come to light. My first instinct was to confide everything to Rachel. But something held me back. As much as I trusted my closest friend, she had always been the type to encourage reconciliation and compromise. Her natural inclination would be to suggest marriage counseling and communication strategies, approaches that would be worse than useless in a situation involving potential criminal corruption. I needed allies who understood that some battles required more aggressive tactics. It was while I was researching David's municipal contracts that I remembered Tom Bradley, the real estate agent who had handled our home purchase 7 years ago. Tom had mentioned during our closing that he specialized in commercial properties and had extensive knowledge of Phoenix development politics. More importantly, he had struck me as someone who paid attention to unusual patterns in property transactions. Exactly the kind of person who might have noticed something suspicious about Amanda's elaborate house purchase. I called Tom's office on Friday morning, using the pretext of asking about property values in our neighborhood. His assistant scheduled me for a meeting that afternoon, and I spent the intervening hours preparing a careful strategy for how much information to reveal and what kind of help to request. Tom's office occupied a corner suite in a glass building near the airport, with windows offering expansive views of the valley sprawling toward distant mountains. He greeted me with the warm professionalism of someone who remembered our previous interactions fondly, though I could see curiosity flickering in his eyes about why I might need his services again. "Lisa, good to see you again," he said, gesturing toward a comfortable seating area away from his desk. "Your assistant mentioned you had questions about property values. Are you and David thinking about making a move?" I settled into the leather chair across from him, choosing my words carefully. "Actually, I'm more interested in understanding some unusual activity in our neighborhood. There's been a property purchase that seems complicated, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me understand what I'm looking at." Tom's expression shifted slightly, the casual friendliness replaced by professional alertness. "What kind of complications are we talking about?" I pulled out copies of the property records I had gathered, spreading them across the coffee table between us. The house at 2847 Maple Street was purchased by a business entity, then transferred to an individual in what appears to be a shell transaction. The timeline suggests the buyer approached the sellers before the property was officially listed, and the purchase price was significantly above market value. Tom leaned forward, studying the documents with the focused attention of someone encountering something genuinely intriguing. His fingers traced the transaction dates, and I could see his mind working through the implications of what he was seeing. "This is interesting," he said after several minutes of silent analysis. "Strategic Consulting Solutions. I don't recognize that entity, which is unusual given how much commercial property work I handle in this market." He looked up at me directly. "Lisa, can I ask why you're investigating this particular transaction? Are you concerned about some kind of impact on your property values?" I had prepared for this question, but sitting across from Tom's expectant face, I realized that half-truths wouldn't be sufficient. If I wanted his genuine help, I needed to trust him with at least part of the real story. "The woman who moved into that house appears to be having an affair with my husband," I said, the words carrying surprising weight when spoken aloud to someone outside my own internal monologue. "But the sophisticated nature of her property acquisition suggests this situation involves more than simple adultery. I'm trying to understand what I'm really dealing with." Tom's eyebrows rose, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "That's a serious situation, Lisa. Have you considered hiring a private investigator to handle this kind of research?" "I've thought about it," I replied, "but I wanted to understand the property angle first. David works on municipal engineering contracts, and I'm concerned that this woman might be targeting him for professional reasons rather than personal ones." The mention of municipal contracts caused a visible shift in Tom's demeanor. He sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he processed this new information. "David works for Henderson Engineering, right? They've been involved in several major city projects recently." I nodded, watching his face carefully. "The Phoenix Infrastructure Development Project, among others, contracts worth millions of dollars." Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying the property records with renewed intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made my pulse quicken. "Lisa, I think you might be dealing with something more serious than you realize. There have been rumors in the development community about information leaks related to city contracts. Nothing concrete, but enough talk to make people nervous about bid processes and contractor selection." My stomach tightened as his words confirmed my worst suspicions. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggests someone with inside access has been sharing confidential information about project specifications, timeline changes, budget modifications. The kind of information that could give certain bidders significant advantages in the contracting process." Tom leaned forward again, his voice lowering slightly. "If your husband is being targeted for that kind of information, then you're not just looking at a marriage problem. You're looking at potential corruption charges." The room seemed to spin slightly as the full implications of what he was saying settled over me. David wasn't just cheating on me. He was potentially committing crimes that could destroy his career, his reputation, and our financial security. And Amanda wasn't just a homewrecker. She was potentially orchestrating a corruption scheme that could implicate multiple people in serious legal violations. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom gathered the property records, aligning them with careful precision as he considered his response. "Officially, I would recommend that you contact the authorities and let them handle the investigation. Unofficially—" He paused, meeting my eyes directly. "Unofficially, I would suggest that you gather as much concrete evidence as possible before involving law enforcement. Once that process begins, you lose control over the timeline and the scope of the investigation." I understood what he was telling me. If I went to the police now, with suspicions but limited proof, they might conduct a preliminary investigation that would alert Amanda and David to the scrutiny. They could cover their tracks, destroy evidence, and leave me with nothing but a destroyed marriage, and no way to protect myself from the financial and legal consequences of David's actions. "How long would I have?" I asked. "That depends on how quickly they're moving toward whatever their endgame is," Tom replied. "But based on the sophistication of this property acquisition, I would guess they're planning something significant in the near future. Municipal contract bid deadlines, project milestone dates, budget approval timelines. There are natural pressure points in these processes that create windows of opportunity." I left Tom's office with a new understanding of the urgency of my situation, but also with a valuable ally who understood the business and political dimensions of what I was facing. Tom had given me his personal cell phone number and promised to reach out to contacts in the development community who might have additional information about suspicious activity around city contracts. My next stop was the Phoenix Public Library, where I could conduct research without leaving digital footprints on my home computer. I spent the remainder of the afternoon diving deep into public records related to David's engineering projects, cross-referencing contract awards with bid timelines and trying to identify patterns that might indicate information leaks. What I discovered was both enlightening and terrifying. Over the past 6 months, several contracts related to David's infrastructure project had been awarded to companies that had submitted bids with remarkable precision. Pricing that came in just under competitors' offers, specifications that addressed requirements not publicly available until after the bid deadline, timeline proposals that accounted for delays that hadn't been announced when bids were submitted. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid triggering obvious red flags, but clear enough to suggest that someone with inside information was sharing critical details with preferred bidders. And the timing aligned perfectly with the period when David had begun working late more frequently, when Amanda had started planning her infiltration of our neighborhood. As I sat in the library's research section, surrounded by printouts and legal documents, I felt the weight of what I was uncovering settle on my shoulders like a physical burden. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore. If I was right about what Amanda and David were doing, their actions were affecting public projects that served thousands of Phoenix residents. Contracts were being awarded based on corrupted information. Taxpayer money was being misdirected, and the integrity of the entire municipal contracting process was being compromised. The personal betrayal of David's affair had been devastating enough, but the realization that he was potentially betraying his professional obligations and public trust added layers of anger and disgust that I struggled to process. The man I had married, the man I had thought I knew, was not just unfaithful. He was corrupt. That evening I called Rachel and asked if she could meet me for dinner. I needed to talk through what I had learned with someone I trusted, even if I couldn't share all the details yet. We met at a quiet restaurant in Tempe, far enough from our neighborhood that I didn't have to worry about running into anyone who might report back to David or Amanda. Rachel took one look at my face and immediately knew something significant had changed since our last conversation. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "What's happened?" I gave her a carefully edited version of what I had discovered. The affair, the suspicious property purchase, the possibility that Amanda's motivations were more complex than simple husband stealing. I couldn't share the details about potential corruption without implicating David in ways that might have legal consequences. But I needed Rachel's perspective on the personal dynamics of what I was facing. "Lisa," Rachel said after I finished explaining, her voice gentle but firm, "this is way beyond anything you should be handling alone. Have you considered that you might be in actual danger?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on gathering evidence and understanding the scope of the situation that I hadn't fully considered the personal risks involved. If Amanda was willing to orchestrate elaborate schemes involving property purchases and corruption, what else might she be willing to do to protect her interests? "I don't think she would physically hurt me," I said, though as the words left my mouth, I realized how naive they sounded. Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. "You're talking about someone who has spent months planning an operation. That involves significant financial stakes and potential criminal activity. People don't go to those lengths unless they're prepared to protect their investments by whatever means necessary." Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the restaurant's aggressive air conditioning. I had been thinking, like someone solving a puzzle, gathering evidence and building a case with the methodical approach I brought to legal research. But Rachel was right. I was dealing with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to engage in deception and manipulation on a sophisticated scale. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. "I think you should talk to a lawyer," Rachel replied without hesitation. "Not just about divorce proceedings, but about protecting yourself legally if David is involved in something criminal. And I think you should consider involving law enforcement sooner rather than later." I nodded, understanding the wisdom of her advice even as part of me resisted the idea of losing control over the investigation. "I need a little more time to gather evidence. Once I involve lawyers and police, this becomes public in ways I can't control." Rachel studied my face carefully. "Lisa, I'm worried that you're becoming obsessed with this situation in ways that might not be healthy. I know David's betrayal has been devastating, but you're starting to sound like you're planning some kind of elaborate revenge rather than just protecting yourself." Her observation hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Over the past few days, I had felt a growing sense of satisfaction at the prospect of exposing Amanda's scheme and David's corruption. The idea of watching their carefully constructed deception collapse under the weight of evidence I had gathered appealed to something dark and angry inside me that I hadn't known existed. "Maybe I am," I admitted. "But they've been playing games with my life while assuming I was too stupid or too weak to fight back. I want them to understand what it feels like to be the victim instead of the predator." Rachel reached across the table and took my hand. "I understand that impulse. I really do. But revenge and justice aren't the same thing, and sometimes the pursuit of revenge ends up destroying the person seeking it more than the people they're trying to punish." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that night, forcing me to examine my motivations more honestly than I had been willing to do. Was I trying to protect myself and expose wrongdoing? Or was I trying to orchestrate Amanda's downfall in the most dramatic and satisfying way possible? The answer, I realized, was probably both. And that recognition made me understand that I needed to be more careful about how I proceeded, both for practical reasons and for the sake of my own psychological well-being. When I arrived home, David was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and papers spread around him. He looked up as I entered, and I was struck by how normal he appeared, how easily he was maintaining the facade of ordinary married life while conducting an affair and potentially committing criminal acts. "Working late again?" I asked, setting my purse on the counter. "Just catching up on some project documentation," he replied, his tone casual but his eyes not quite meeting mine. "The city is requesting additional environmental impact assessments, and I want to make sure we're ahead of the curve." I nodded sympathetically, though I wondered if those environmental impact assessments were the kind of confidential information that Amanda was helping him share with preferred bidders. Sounds stressful. Are you feeling a lot of pressure from the higher-ups? David's fingers paused over his keyboard for just a moment. Some. This is a big project, and there are a lot of stakeholders with conflicting interests. Sometimes it feels like navigating a minefield. The metaphor was more apt than he probably realized. Well, I'm sure you'll figure it out. You always do. He smiled at me then, the kind of warm, appreciative expression that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him years ago. For a moment, I felt a stab of grief for the marriage we had lost, for the man I had thought he was, for the future we had planned together that was now impossible. But then I noticed that his laptop screen was angled away from me, that his papers were positioned so I couldn't read them, that he had closed what appeared to be an email application when I walked into the room. Even in this moment of apparent normalcy, David was hiding things from me, maintaining the deception that had become the foundation of our relationship. I'm going to take a bath and get to bed early, I said, keeping my voice light. I've had a long day. Okay, honey, I'll be up in a little while. As I headed toward the stairs, I caught a glimpse of David's reflection in the kitchen window. He was already reaching for his phone, probably to text Amanda about my early retirement for the evening. The casualness of his deception, the ease with which he was managing his double life, reinforced my determination to see this situation through to whatever conclusion awaited us. I spent the next hour in the bathtub, letting the hot water ease the tension that had been building in my shoulders for days, but my mind remained active, processing everything I had learned and developing strategies for the next phases of my investigation. Tom Bradley was researching the business connections that might explain Amanda's funding and objectives. I had identified patterns in municipal contract awards that suggested systematic information sharing. I had documented David's affair and Amanda's surveillance activities. What I needed now was more direct evidence of the corruption itself, communications between David and Amanda that explicitly discussed confidential information, records of payments or benefits that Amanda might be providing to David, documentation of how the leaked information was being used to influence bid processes. Getting that evidence would require taking risks I hadn't been willing to consider before. It would mean more aggressive surveillance, possibly including attempts to access David's communications or Amanda's business records. It would mean moving from passive observation to active investigation in ways that could expose me to legal liability if I made mistakes. But as I lay in the bathtub, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the scope of what David and Amanda were doing, I realized that the risks of inaction were greater than the risks of aggressive investigation. If I allowed this situation to continue without intervention, David would continue compromising municipal contracts. Amanda would continue orchestrating whatever larger scheme she was pursuing, and I would remain trapped in a marriage built on lies and criminal activity. The woman who had discovered her husband's affair 3 weeks ago might have been willing to settle for divorce and financial protection. But the woman who now understood the full scope of David's betrayal, personal, professional, and civic, was prepared to do whatever was necessary to bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. As I got ready for bed, I could hear David still moving around downstairs, probably sending messages to Amanda or reviewing documents related to their shared activities. The sounds of his presence in our house, once comforting and familiar, now felt like evidence of an elaborate performance designed to maintain his cover, while he systematically destroyed everything we had built together. I climbed into bed and turned off the lights, but I didn't close my eyes. Instead, I stared out the window toward Amanda's house, where lights were still burning behind those carefully positioned curtains. She was probably planning her next moves, refining whatever strategy she was using to extract information from David, preparing for whatever endgame she had been working toward for months. But Amanda had made a critical error in her calculations. She had assumed that the wife she was betraying would remain a passive victim, someone to be managed and manipulated rather than a genuine threat to her objectives. She had focused so intently on seducing David and corrupting his professional judgment that she had failed to consider what might happen if his wife decided to fight back with the same level of sophistication and determination that Amanda herself was bringing to the situation. Tomorrow, I would begin the most dangerous phase of my investigation. Tomorrow, I would stop being a victim and start being a predator. And Amanda Walsh was about to discover that she had chosen the wrong family to destroy. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Tom Bradley called at 7:30, his voice carrying an urgency that made me grip the phone tighter as I stepped out onto our back patio, away from David's earshot. "Lisa, I've been making calls since yesterday afternoon, and what I found is bigger than we thought," he said without preamble. "Strategic Consulting Solutions isn't just a shell company for property purchases. It's connected to a network of businesses that have been systematically winning municipal contracts across 3 different Arizona cities." I felt my pulse accelerate as I processed his words. How many contracts are we talking about? Dozens. Millions of dollars in public works projects over the past 18 months. And here's the thing. Every single one of these companies has connections to the same investment group based out of Las Vegas. They're not just leaking information about Phoenix contracts, Lisa. They're running a coordinated operation across multiple municipalities. The scope of what he was describing made my head spin. This wasn't just about David's affair, or even his potential corruption. Amanda was part of something much larger, a systematic exploitation of public contracting processes that was defrauding taxpayers across the entire region. "What kind of investment group?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. "The kind that has enough capital to purchase houses as operational assets and enough patience to run long-term infiltration campaigns? The kind that views municipal employees like your husband as investment opportunities rather than human beings." Tom's voice carried a grimness that made my stomach tighten. "Lisa, these people aren't playing games. If they're willing to commit fraud on this scale, they won't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operation." His warning echoed Rachel's concerns from the night before, but with additional context that made the danger feel immediate and concrete. I wasn't just dealing with a cheating husband and a manipulative neighbor. I was up against what appeared to be an organized criminal enterprise with significant resources and demonstrated willingness to engage in illegal activity. "I need to get concrete evidence," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Something that proves the connection between David's information and the contract awards." "Lisa, please reconsider involving law enforcement. What you're describing sounds like it should be handled by federal authorities, not by someone conducting amateur surveillance." I understood his concern, but I also knew that once I contacted the FBI or other federal agencies, I would lose all control over the investigation timeline. They might spend months building a case while David and Amanda continued their activities, or they might conduct a premature raid that allowed key evidence to be destroyed. I needed irrefutable proof before bringing in outside authorities. "Give me 1 more week," I said. "If I can't get definitive evidence by then, I'll contact whoever you think should handle this." Tom was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Okay, but please be careful, and keep me informed about what you're finding. If this situation escalates, you're going to need people who can vouch for your investigation methods and timeline." After ending the call, I stood on our patio looking across the street at Amanda's house with new eyes. The woman I had, initially, seen as a threat to my marriage was actually part of a criminal organization that was systematically corrupting public contracting processes. David wasn't just having an affair. He was providing information that was being used to defraud taxpayers and undermine the integrity of municipal government. The personal betrayal was devastating enough, but the realization that David was betraying his professional obligations and public trust added dimensions of anger and disgust that I struggled to process. I had married a man I thought was fundamentally decent, someone whose moral compass I trusted implicitly. Discovering that he was willing to compromise his professional ethics for whatever benefits Amanda was providing felt like learning that everything I thought I knew about his character had been an illusion. I spent the rest of the morning developing a plan for obtaining the evidence I needed. David's home office contained files related to his municipal projects, but he kept the most sensitive documents in a locked filing cabinet that I had never had reason to access. His laptop was password protected, and he was careful to never leave it unattended when it was open. His cell phone was similarly secured, and he had become increasingly protective of it over the past few months. Getting access to any of these sources would require careful timing and considerable risk. But I realized I had one advantage that David probably hadn't considered. My professional background as a paralegal had given me skills in document analysis and evidence gathering that went beyond simple snooping. If I could find the right opportunity, I might be able to identify and copy the most damaging evidence before David realized his security had been compromised. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. That afternoon, David called to say he would be working late on a client presentation, a claim I now understood meant he would be spending time with Amanda. The timing was perfect. I could conduct a thorough search of his office without worrying about his unexpected return. I waited until I was certain David had left the office building, using the tracking methods I had developed to monitor his actual whereabouts versus his stated schedule. When I confirmed that his car was parked at Amanda's house, I returned home and began the most systematic search I had ever conducted. David's filing cabinet yielded disappointing results initially, mostly routine project documentation that didn't reveal any obvious information sharing. But hidden in a folder labeled Environmental Assessments, I found something that made my hands shake. Copies of internal city memos about timeline changes and budget modifications, documents that were marked confidential, not for external distribution, but were clearly being shared outside official channels. More damaging were the handwritten notes in David's distinctive script, detailing information that hadn't been publicly released but would be valuable to bidders trying to position themselves advantageously. Project specification changes, regulatory approval delays, budget reallocation, decisions, all the kind of inside information that could give contractors significant competitive advantages. But the most devastating discovery was a series of printed emails between David and someone identified only as AW. The messages were cryptic but clearly referenced information sharing and coordination around bid deadlines. One email in particular made my stomach lurch. Timeline adjustment confirmed for Thursday announcement. Package delivery as discussed. Looking forward to celebrating the successful outcome. The language was careful enough to maintain plausible deniability, but the timing aligned perfectly with a major contract award that had been announced the previous month. David wasn't just sharing information, he was actively coordinating with Amanda to ensure that confidential details reached the right people at the right times. I photographed everything with my phone, being careful to maintain the original organization so David wouldn't realize his files had been accessed. But as I was returning the documents to their proper locations, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the garage door opening. David was home 3 hours earlier than expected. I quickly closed the filing cabinet and moved toward the kitchen, trying to appear casual despite my racing pulse. When David walked through the door, he looked surprised to see me. "I thought you'd still be at work," he said, setting his briefcase on the counter. "I had a headache and decided to come home early," I replied, hoping my voice sounded normal. "What about you? I thought you had a late presentation." David's expression flickered for just a moment, the same guilty look that had become familiar over the past few weeks. The client had to reschedule. Technical difficulties with their presentation equipment. The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others I had accepted without question over the months of his deception. But now, armed with concrete evidence of his corruption, I found myself studying his performance with detached fascination rather than hurt or anger. "That's frustrating," I said sympathetically. "These technical issues always seem to happen at the worst times." "Yeah, it's annoying, but it gives me more time to refine my materials." David moved toward his office, and I felt a moment of panic that he might notice something disturbed in his filing system. But he simply grabbed a different folder from his desk and returned to the kitchen. "I might work on it here at the table, if that's okay." I nodded, though I noticed he was careful to position himself so that I couldn't see the documents he was reviewing. Even this casual work session was being conducted with the same secretive precautions that had become standard in our household. That evening, I uploaded the photographs I had taken to a secure cloud storage account, making sure the evidence was preserved in multiple locations. The documents I had found were damaging enough to destroy David's career and potentially land him in federal prison, but I still needed more direct proof of Amanda's role in the operation. I decided to take a risk that I knew Rachel would disapprove of. Using techniques I had learned during my paralegal training for conducting due diligence investigations, I began researching Amanda's background more aggressively. Public records, searches, professional license databases, social media analysis, any source of information that might reveal her true identity and connections. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Amanda Walsh appeared to have no significant digital footprint prior to 18 months ago. No college records, no previous employment history, no social media presence that extended beyond the carefully curated profiles she maintained for her consulting business. It was as if she had been created specifically for this operation, a fictional identity constructed to facilitate her infiltration of Phoenix's municipal contracting process. But buried in property records from Las Vegas, I found a connection that made everything click into place. A woman named Amanda Walensky had purchased and sold several properties in Nevada over the past 5 years, always at significant profits and always in conjunction with major development projects. The timing and financial patterns suggested someone with advanced knowledge of municipal planning decisions, someone who was using inside information to make strategic real estate investments. Amanda Walsh and Amanda Walensky were the same person. The realization that Amanda was using a modified identity added new dimensions to the criminal enterprise I was uncovering. This wasn't just corruption, it was identity fraud, racketeering, and potentially money laundering on a scale that would attract federal attention from multiple agencies. I spent the next 2 days gathering additional evidence about Amanda's true identity and her connections to the Las Vegas investment group Tom had mentioned. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had been conducting similar operations in multiple cities, using romance and seduction to compromise municipal employees and extract valuable information about public contracting processes. David wasn't her first victim. He was just her latest. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Amanda would research municipal employees who had access to valuable information, identify those who appeared vulnerable to seduction, then engineer elaborate scenarios that brought her into their lives. The house purchases, the carefully crafted identities, the sophisticated coordination with bidding companies. It was all part of a business model that had been refined through multiple successful operations. But as I compiled this evidence, I also discovered something that chilled me to the bone. In 2 previous cities, the municipal employees who had been compromised by Amanda's operations had died in apparent accidents within months of their usefulness ending. A car crash in Nevada, a drowning incident in Colorado, both investigated by local authorities and ruled accidental, but both occurring at suspiciously convenient times for people who might have been considered loose ends in criminal enterprises. The possibility that David might be in physical danger once Amanda's operation concluded added urgency to my investigation that went beyond personal betrayal or professional corruption. If Amanda and her associates were willing to eliminate people who could expose their activities, then David's life might be at risk regardless of his willing participation in their scheme. I called Tom Bradley that evening, sharing what I had learned about Amanda's true identity and her pattern of operations in other cities. His reaction was immediate and unambiguous. "Lisa, you need to contact the FBI tonight. What you're describing involves interstate racketeering, identity fraud, and possibly murder. This is way beyond anything that should be handled through private investigation." I knew he was right, but I also knew that I was close to obtaining evidence that would make the federal case ironclad. "I need 48 more hours. There's something big happening this week. I can feel it in how nervous David has been, how much time he's spending with Amanda. If I can document whatever they're planning, it will give federal investigators everything they need to take down the entire operation." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "What aren't you telling me, Lisa? There's something about this situation that you're not sharing." His intuition was accurate, but I wasn't ready to tell him about my discovery of Amanda's possible involvement in the deaths of her previous targets. That information would only reinforce his insistence that I contact authorities immediately, and I wanted to gather more evidence about David's current danger level before bringing in outside agencies that might inadvertently escalate the risk to his safety. "I just want to make sure I have enough evidence to protect David legally when this comes out," I said, which was true even if it wasn't the complete truth. If he's been manipulated into participating in something he didn't fully understand, I want to be able to demonstrate that to federal prosecutors. It was after midnight when I finally ended my research session and prepared for bed. David had been in his office most of the evening, working on what he claimed were project modifications, but which I now understood were probably coordinated information-sharing activities with Amanda. The casual efficiency with which he was managing his double life, maintaining our marriage while systematically betraying his professional obligations, revealed aspects of his character that I was still struggling to process. As I lay in bed listening to David's quiet breathing, I realized that regardless of what happened with the criminal investigation, my marriage was over. Even if David had been manipulated into participating in Amanda's scheme, even if he genuinely loved me despite his affair, the level of deception required to maintain his activities for months demonstrated a capacity for sustained lying that made trust impossible. But ending our marriage was a luxury I couldn't afford until I understood the full scope of the danger we were both facing. If Amanda and her associates were willing to eliminate people who threatened their operation, then my investigation had potentially put both David and me at risk. I needed to gather enough evidence to ensure that law enforcement could dismantle the entire criminal enterprise before anyone decided that we represented unacceptable threats to their activities. The next morning brought confirmation that something significant was happening. David left for work earlier than usual, and when I conducted my routine surveillance of Amanda's house, I noticed increased activity that suggested preparation for some kind of major event. Multiple cars visited her house throughout the day, and I could see people moving equipment that looked like computer hardware and communication devices. Most telling was Amanda's behavior when David arrived for what had become his regular afternoon visits. Instead of the relaxed intimacy that had characterized their previous encounters, their interaction appeared businesslike and urgent. They spent most of their time indoors, away from windows, conducting what appeared to be serious planning sessions rather than romantic interludes. I realized that whatever operation they had been working toward was approaching its culmination. The months of preparation, information gathering, and relationship building were about to pay off in some concrete action that would justify all the elaborate planning and risk-taking. That evening, I made a decision that I knew Rachel and Tom would both disapprove of. Instead of contacting federal authorities immediately, I was going to conduct one final surveillance operation to document whatever Amanda and David were planning. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward, evidence that could expose the entire criminal enterprise and protect David from being eliminated as a loose end, seemed worth the danger. I prepared for what I hoped would be the final phase of my investigation by gathering equipment and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. Whatever Amanda's endgame was, I was going to be there to document it. And when it was over, I would have everything I needed to bring down the woman who had destroyed my marriage and corrupted my husband. The war that had begun with a suspicious neighbor and a cheating husband was about to reach its conclusion, and Amanda Walsh was about to discover that she had underestimated the wrong woman one final time. The opportunity for final surveillance came on Thursday evening when David announced he would be attending a mandatory project meeting that could run past midnight. The timing felt deliberate, and when I watched him load an overnight bag into his car while talking on the phone in hushed tones, I knew this was the culmination event I had been waiting to document. I gave David a 30-minute head start before beginning my own preparation. I had purchased professional surveillance equipment over the past week, a directional microphone, night vision camera, and recording devices that would capture both audio and video evidence of whatever was about to unfold. If Amanda's operation was reaching its climax, I intended to document every detail that would help federal investigators dismantle the entire criminal network. The drive to Amanda's neighborhood required careful route planning to avoid detection. I parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, using the desert landscaping and architectural features of the subdivision to maintain cover as I moved into position. The equipment bag felt heavier than expected, weighted with the significance of what I was attempting to accomplish. Amanda's house showed unusual activity from the moment I arrived. Multiple vehicles were parked in her driveway and along the street, expensive sedans and SUVs that suggested the presence of people with significant financial resources. Through her front windows, I could see figures moving around what appeared to be sophisticated electronic equipment, computers, and communication devices that transformed her living room into something resembling a command center. I established my surveillance position in a cluster of desert shrubs that provided clear sightlines to both Amanda's front entrance and the large windows facing the street. The night vision camera revealed details that would have been invisible to naked eye observation, and the directional microphone began picking up fragments of conversation that made my pulse quicken with excitement and terror. Final authorization came through this afternoon, a male voice was saying, someone I didn't recognize but whose tone carried the authority of leadership. Phoenix contracts are locked in, Amanda replied, her voice carrying a satisfaction. That made my stomach clench. Timeline accelerated based on insider modifications. We're looking at successful bid announcements by Monday. And our asset? The male voice asked. Still cooperative? Completely compromised, Amanda said with casual cruelty. He has no idea how much information he's provided or how it's being used. Perfect operational security from his perspective. The callous way she discussed David, referring to him as an asset rather than a person, crystallized everything I had suspected about her motivations. He wasn't her lover, or even her victim in any meaningful sense. He was simply a resource to be exploited until his usefulness expired. Cleanup timeline? Another voice asked, female this time, speaking with the efficient tone of someone discussing logistical details. Standard protocol, Amanda replied. Asset elimination within 60 days of project completion. Make it look accidental, as usual. The words hit me like a physical blow. They were planning to kill David once the current contracting fraud was completed, disposing of him the same way they had apparently eliminated previous targets in Nevada and Colorado. My husband wasn't just being used for information, he was being set up for murder. I forced myself to continue recording despite the nausea rising in my throat. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, revealing details about bank accounts in offshore jurisdictions, plans for relocating the operation to different cities, and coordination with criminal associates across multiple states. What I was documenting wasn't just municipal corruption. It was evidence of an organized crime enterprise that had been operating successfully for years. When David finally arrived at Amanda's house, I watched through the night vision camera as she greeted him with an affection that now appeared grotesquely manipulative. He carried himself with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was participating in something dangerous, but felt powerless to extract himself from the situation. Everything ready for tomorrow? David asked as they moved toward the house. Perfect timing, Amanda replied, her hand resting possessively on his arm. The bid specifications you provided last week were exactly what we needed. Our partners are very pleased with your contributions. David's smile in response to her praise made me feel sick. He was basking in approval from people who were planning to murder him, congratulating himself on successfully betraying his professional obligations without understanding that he was signing his own death warrant. I continued recording as the group inside Amanda's house conducted what appeared to be a final planning session for whatever fraudulent contracting scheme they intended to execute. The conversation revealed the scope of their coordination: bribed officials in multiple municipalities, shell companies designed to win contracts through insider information, and financial structures that laundered the proceeds through legitimate-appearing business transactions. But it was when they began discussing David's future role that I realized the immediate danger he was facing. The criminal organization had been using him to access information about upcoming projects worth tens of millions of dollars, but those projects wouldn't begin for several months. From their perspective, David had already provided most of the valuable intelligence they needed, making him a liability rather than an asset. Timeline for asset disposal needs to be accelerated, the male leader was saying. Too much exposure. Risk if we maintain current operational security. I can handle it this weekend, Amanda replied with chilling casualness. Car accident during one of his late-night drives. Simple and clean. They were planning to kill my husband within days. The recording equipment captured everything. Their voices, their faces visible through the windows, the details of their criminal conspiracy and murder plot. I had more than enough evidence to ensure federal prosecution of the entire organization, but I also had information that revealed David was in immediate mortal danger. I remained in position for another hour, gathering additional evidence about their financial structures and criminal associates, but my mind was racing through options for how to handle what I had discovered. Contacting federal authorities would ultimately provide the most comprehensive solution, but the investigation and arrest process could take days or weeks, time that David didn't have if Amanda was planning to eliminate him over the weekend. I needed to find a way to protect David immediately while ensuring that the criminal organization couldn't escape justice or retaliate against either of us. The solution that emerged in my mind was risky and complex, but it offered the possibility of achieving both objectives simultaneously. When I finally packed up my surveillance equipment and prepared to leave, I felt the weight of knowledge that changed everything about my situation. I wasn't just dealing with a cheating husband and a manipulative neighbor anymore. I was the only person who knew about a murder plot against David, and the only person with evidence that could bring down an organized crime network that had been operating successfully across multiple states. The drive home required constant attention to my mirrors and surroundings. Paranoia justified by the realization that I was now a direct threat to people who had demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their interests. If Amanda or her associates discovered my surveillance activities, I would likely join David on their elimination list. I arrived home to find the house empty, exactly as I had expected. David was spending the night at Amanda's house, probably believing he was enjoying romantic time with his mistress while actually participating in the final planning session for criminal activities that would lead to his death. I spent the remainder of the night organizing the evidence I had gathered and developing a comprehensive plan for exposing the criminal conspiracy while protecting David from immediate harm. The strategy I developed was complex and required precise timing, but it offered the best chance of achieving all my objectives simultaneously. First, I prepared detailed packages of evidence for multiple federal agencies, the FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and Department of Justice Public. Integrity section? Each package contained copies of all the surveillance recordings, photographs of criminal associates, documentation of the fraudulent contracting schemes, and analysis connecting Amanda's current operation to similar crimes in other states. I arranged for these packages to be delivered simultaneously on Friday morning, ensuring that multiple agencies would begin investigating before the criminal organization could realize their exposure. Second, I prepared a comprehensive dossier for Phoenix media outlets, including television stations and newspaper investigative reporters who specialized in government corruption stories. The media attention would create public pressure for aggressive prosecution while making it difficult for the criminals to eliminate witnesses without attracting additional scrutiny. Third, and most critically, I developed a plan for confronting David with evidence of his danger, while giving him an opportunity to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for protection and reduced charges. The confrontation I had been planning for weeks would finally happen, but under circumstances I could never have anticipated when this situation began. David returned home Friday morning looking exhausted and strangely subdued. He moved through his normal routine, shower, coffee, preparation for work, with mechanical precision, but I could see tension in his shoulders and distraction in his expression that suggested internal conflict. "You look tired," I said as he reached for his car keys. "Couldn't sleep well," he replied without meeting my eyes. "Too much on my mind with work projects." I knew this was my moment. "David, we need to talk about Amanda." He froze, his hand tightening around the keys. "What about Amanda?" "I know about the affair," I said quietly. "And I know about the information you've been sharing with her about your municipal projects." David's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, fear, and finally resignation. He set his keys on the counter and turned toward me with the posture of someone who had been caught in something he could no longer deny. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Weeks," I replied. "But that's not the important question right now. The important question is whether you understand how much danger you're in." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Danger? Lisa, I know this. Looks bad, but it's not what you think. Amanda and we're not just having an affair. She's been helping me navigate some complicated political aspects of the contracting process." The naivety of his explanation would have been touching, if it weren't so potentially fatal. David genuinely believed that Amanda cared about him, that her interest in his professional activities was motivated by desire to help, rather than criminal exploitation. "David," I said gently, "Amanda isn't who she claims to be. Her real name is Amanda Walensky, and she's part of an organized crime network that has been running corruption schemes in multiple cities. You're not her boyfriend. You're her target." I showed him selected portions of the evidence I had gathered: property records revealing her false identity, documentation of similar operations in other states, and photographs of the criminal, associates who had been at her house the previous evening. I watched his face change as the implications settled in, watched him realize that everything he thought he understood about his relationship with Amanda had been an elaborate deception. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "There's more," I said, and then I told him about the recorded conversation in which Amanda and her associates discussed plans for his elimination. I watched the color drain from his face as he processed the reality that the woman he thought loved him was actually planning his murder. David collapsed into a kitchen chair, his hands shaking as the full scope of his situation became clear. "What am I going to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "You're going to cooperate with federal authorities," I replied. "I've already contacted the FBI, and they're going to want to debrief you about everything Amanda has asked you to provide. In exchange for your cooperation, they can offer protection and consideration for reduced charges." The relief that flooded his expression was mixed with shame and gratitude in ways that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him years before. Despite his betrayal, despite his corruption, David was fundamentally a decent person who had been manipulated by people far more sophisticated and ruthless than he had ever imagined. "Lisa," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought she cared about me." I felt a complex mix of emotions, anger at his betrayal, sadness for his victimization, and relief that he was going to survive Amanda's murder plot. Our marriage was over, destroyed by months of deception and corruption. But David was going to live to rebuild his life in whatever form remained possible after federal prosecution. The FBI agents arrived at our house that afternoon, professional and efficient as they began the process of debriefing David and collecting evidence about Amanda's criminal organization. I watched from our living room as David provided detailed information about every conversation, every document sharing, every aspect of his relationship with Amanda that had seemed innocent but was actually part of an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Through our front window, I could see unusual activity at Amanda's house as federal agents executed search warrants and arrested the criminal associates who had been planning David's murder. Amanda herself was taken into custody while carrying luggage that suggested she had been preparing to flee Phoenix after completing her operation. The woman who had seemed so sophisticated and dangerous as she manipulated her way into our lives looked small and ordinary in handcuffs, just another criminal who had overestimated her abilities and underestimated the people she was trying to exploit. The federal investigation would eventually reveal the full scope of Amanda's criminal network: dozens of corrupted municipal employees across multiple states, millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts, and at least 3 murders disguised as accidents. David's cooperation would prove essential to prosecuting the entire organization, earning him protection from retaliation and consideration for reduced prison time. Our divorce was finalized 6 months later, a quiet legal proceeding that dissolved, a marriage destroyed by deception but ended without the bitterness that might have characterized our separation under different circumstances. David served 18 months in federal prison, a sentence that reflected both his crimes and his cooperation with authorities. I used the settlement to relocate to Colorado, where I started over with a new job and the hard-won knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The house at 2847 Maple Street remained empty for over a year after Amanda's arrest, a reminder to the neighborhood of how completely we had all been deceived by someone who had seemed like nothing more than a friendly new neighbor. When it was finally sold, the new owners were a retired couple from Minnesota who spent their time gardening and volunteering at local charities. The kind of genuinely normal neighbors we had thought Amanda was when she first moved across the street. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had trusted my initial instincts about Amanda, if I had acted sooner on the suspicions that began the day I watched her studying our house with calculating eyes. But I also know that without the evidence I gathered through weeks of careful investigation, federal authorities might never have uncovered the full scope of her criminal organization, and David might have become another victim of an apparent accident that was actually murder. The experience taught me that betrayal could come from the people closest to us, but it also taught me that we have more power to protect ourselves than we often realize. When Amanda moved across the street to destroy my marriage and corrupt my husband, she assumed she was dealing with a passive victim who would never fight back. She was wrong about that, just as she was wrong about so many other things. And in the end, that mistake cost her everything she had worked to build, while teaching me that I was capable of things I had never imagined when this whole situation began. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.